U.S. history class. How you guys doing? I hope everybody's staying safe, being nice to your siblings, don't drive your parents nuts. Okay, young historians. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics in American history, coming out of one of my favorite eras. We're going to be talking World War II, but specifically we're going to be talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. They came up in yesterday's lesson. I promised to revisit it, so I made a lesson just about the Tuskegee Airmen. But before I do that, I mentioned this on Wednesday's lesson, I believe. But both my grandparents, my grandfathers, fought in World War II, and since that's what we're studying right now, I wanted to show you some pictures that I thought were really cool. That's my granddad, Hardin Theodore Pendergrass. He was in the 361st Infantry and he fought in France. He actually was shot, I believe, right about there and got a Purple Heart. This picture's even cooler. That's him sitting at the front on the donkey. And if you look down, to hell with Hitler. This guy looks like maybe an officer of some kind. He's got a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. That's pretty cool. That's history right there. I'm gonna get choked up. Can't be doing that. Okay, where were we? But let's get started talking about a different group of soldiers. One of the most celebrated units in the history of the American military, really in the history of the military, because they broke a barrier that had existed for centuries, at least in the United States. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the AAC. Eventually, the AAC became the Air Force. They trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, and they flew more than 15,000 individual sorties in Europe and North Africa, during World War II. 15,000. Their impressive performance earned them more than 150 distinguished flying crosses and helped encourage the eventual integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. That's one of their greatest legacies, is leading to the integration. Because keep in mind, these guys were um, fighter pilots, and they still had to serve in segregated units. During the 1920s and 30s, the exploits of record setting pilots like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart had captivated the nation, and thousands of young men and women clamored to follow in their footsteps. You guys remember when we talked about Lindbergh, how he was quite literally the biggest celebrity in the nation and one of the biggest on the planet. He made flying, he brought it to the consciousness of the mainstream. So now you've got a whole new generation of Americans who want to be a pilot, just like their hero, Charles Lindbergh. But young African Americans who aspired to become pilots, they faced a lot of obstacles. Um, the biggest one, just the most fundamental one, was that there was a belief on the part of the white establishment that black people weren't smart enough to learn how to fly. So that's the kind of um, prejudice that they were having to overcome. In 1938, with Europe teetering on the brink of another Great War, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced he would expand the civilian pilot training program in the United States. At the time, racial segregation remained the rule in the U.S. Armed Forces as well as much of the country, certainly here in Georgia. Much of the military establishment, especially in the South, believed black soldiers were inferior to whites and that they performed poorly in combat. But as the AAC began ramping up its training program, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier joined civil rights groups like the NAACP in arguing that black Americans be included. They called it the Tuskegee Experiment. In September 1940, Roosevelt's White House responded to such lobbying campaigns by announcing that the AAC would begin training black pilots. For the training site, the War Department chose the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, which was being built under construction. That was home to the Tuskegee Institute, founded by activist Booker T. Washington. So you've got this thing that is so progressive and was opposed so strongly by white racists, especially in the Deep South, which had another just about 30 years of integration, or excuse me, of segregation ahead of it. They plucked these trainees out, and put them in the heart of enemy territory, basically, in the Jim Crow South. I shouldn't say enemy territory, but they placed them, they were growing up, excuse me, they were training in a very tense environment. The program's trainees, nearly all of them college graduates or undergraduates, came from all over the country. They had 1,000 pilots. They trained nearly 14,000 navigators, bombardiers, instructors, aircraft and engine mechanics, control tower operators, and other maintenance and support staff. So there were 1,000 pilots, give or take, but 15,000 or so total. We're going to talk about this guy specifically, a man named Benjamin O. Davis Jr., General Benjamin O. Davis. He was in the first class of aviation cadets in 1941. He was a graduate of West Point and the son of Brigadier General Benjamin Davis. So his father was a brigadier general. He went to the U.S. Military Academy. Definitely well groomed for a life as a military leader. Davis was the first black general in the force, what's now the Air Force, and one of only 2 black officers, other than chaplains, in the entire U.S. military. Generals. There he is. That's his West Point photograph. There's a picture of him in his plane in Tuskegee. This was a big moment for the Tuskegee experiment. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who we talked about when we talked about the New Deal, she was somewhat of an activist herself. Not somewhat, she was an activist. She was considered very involved for a First Lady. And she actually took a visit to Alabama. And she went on an aerial tour with a guy named Charles Chief Anderson. So the photographs of the First Lady going to Alabama to not only visit the Tuskegee Airmen, but to actually place her life in their hands, that went a long way towards establishing the validity or getting wider respect or appreciation for the program. There's Eleanor Roosevelt. There's Chief. In the actual war, in April 1942, the Tuskegee trained 99th Pursuit Squadron, cool name, deployed to North Africa, which the Allies had occupied. In North Africa and then Sicily, they flew missions in second-hand P-40 planes, which were slower and more difficult to maneuver than their German counterparts. After the commander of the 99th Assigned Fighter Group complained about the squadron's performance, Davis had to defend his men before a War Department committee. So they gave them worse equipment and then were critical of their performance. Rather than being shipped home, the 99th was moved to Italy, where they served alongside the white pilots of the 79th Fighter Group. In early 1944, pilots from the 99th shot down 12 German fighters in 2 days, going some distance towards proving themselves in combat. In February 1944, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons arrived in Italy. Together with the 99th, these squadrons of black pilots and other personnel made up the new 332nd Fighter Group. After this transfer, the pilots of the 332nd began flying P-51 Mustangs to escort the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force during raids deep into enemy territory. The tails of their planes were painted red for identification purposes, earning them the enduring nickname Red Tails. Though these were the best known of the Tuskegee Airmen, black aviators also served on bomber crews in the 477th Bombardment Group, formed in 1944. A popular myth arose during the war and persisted afterwards that in more than 200 escort missions, the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a bomber. The truth wasn't uncovered until a year later when a detailed analysis found that enemy aircraft shot down at least 25 bombers they escorted. Nonetheless, that was a much better success rate than other escort groups of the 15th Air Force, which lost an average of 46. So they didn't go without ever losing one, but they lost a little over half as much as the average. What's their legacy? By the time the 332nd flew its last combat mission on April 26, 1945, 2 weeks before the German surrender, the Tuskegee Airmen had flown more than 15,000 individual sorties over 2 years in combat. They had destroyed or damaged 36 German planes in the air and 237 on the ground, as well as nearly 1,000 rail cars and transport vehicles and a German destroyer. In all, 66 trained aviators, 66 Tuskegee trained aviators were killed in action during World War II, while another 32 were captured as POWs after being shot down. After their brave service, the Tuskegee Airmen returned home to a country where they continued to face systematic racism and prejudice. But they did represent an important step forward in preparing the nation for the racial integration of the military, which began with President Harry Truman, who issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces and mandating equality of opportunity and treatment on July 26, 1948. And I actually found that. So let's check this out. Don't you go freezing on me. That's pretty cool. Where were we? After their brave service, the oh, we already read that. Moving on. A number of the original Tuskegee Airmen would go on to longer careers in the military, including Davis, who would become the first black general in the new U.S. Air Force. George S. Spanky Roberts, who became the first black commander of a racially integrated Air Force unit before retiring as a colonel, and Daniel Chappie James Jr., who would become the nation's first black four-star general in 1975. Excuse me. More than 300 of the original Tuskegee Airmen were on hand to receive the Congressional Gold Medal from President George W. Bush in 2007. 2 years later, the surviving Tuskegee trained pilots and support crew were invited. It's not coronavirus, guys, just a cough. They were invited to attend the inauguration of the nation's first African American president, Barack Obama, who once wrote that his career in public service was made possible by the path of heroes like the Tuskegee Airmen trailblazed. I want to show us something. This is really cool. I found this and it was posted by something called Eschaton Seniors. And I've always said, you have to, check your sources. And I found Eschaton Seniors is a bunch of retirement communities. So places where, old people go live. And I found a video. One of them wanted to celebrate one of their residents, and I thought this was cool. So let's check this out.
I just enjoyed what I did, and I did what I had to do for my country. We were all underage at the time. I joined the military in 1945 at the age of 15. I went to Tuskegee, Alabama, where the pilot training school was for blacks. President Roosevelt sent his wife Eleanor down to Tuskegee, Alabama. They didn't think that blacks could fly. He told Eleanor, he said, I want you to go down to Tuskegee and see if those black guys can actually fly. So she came on down there, and Chief Anderson took on a flight. She enjoyed it. They came down, they landed. She went on back to Washington and told the president, those kids, they can fly. Blacks couldn't go into the officers club along with white officers. The black officers decided, hey, we're doing as much for this country as anybody else. And we're going to go in there and have a drink in that club. We did it. We had a big fight. After the fight was over, the MPs separated everybody. That's the military police. We all had a drink and we all made friends after this was all over with. When the German escorts that came to meet us, they used to see the red tail and say, oh, goddamn, we know those red tails are blacks. They turned around and went back. We never lost too many aircraft. We never lost too many pilots because we did our job. I was in World War II. I was a forward observer. I was in the Korean War. I was a master sergeant. I was in Vietnam in intelligence. What it means to be an American, that you're free. You're free to do anything you want to do.
It's a pretty epic answer. What does it mean to be an American? It means you're free to do what you want to do. That's a guy who has really been through some stuff. Um, okay, so your classwork for today, week four, for analysis assignment. Piece of cake. Which First Lady made headlines by visiting the Tuskegee Airmen? In September 1940, Roosevelt's White House responded to such lobbying campaigns by announcing that the AAC would soon begin doing what? Who founded the Tuskegee Institute? True or false? World War II was the first time black soldiers fought in the Army. And which Tuskegee Airman was the first African American general? So, with that, actually, one more thing before I let you go. I found something that was really cool when I was looking up my granddad, and I found his enlistment information. Hardin T. Pendergrass. Oh, well, guys, just take my word for it. Okay, good job this week. You guys have really done a pretty good job on getting everything in on time. So keep up the good work as far as that's concerned. Beyond that, I hope you have a great weekend. Um, hope everybody's staying safe and that you guys are doing all right. I miss you. Stop by the Zoom class sometime and see me. 10:30 a.m.